Good afternoon, and welcome to the sixth and final session of this conference, A Modern Teaching Profession: Compensation, Preparation, Representation, and Evaluation, sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance here at the Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Antonio Wendell, and I'm the Associate Director for the program. Before we start, just a couple of logistical matters. This is a Zoom webinar, and it's being recorded. It will eventually be posted, and the other sessions have already been put online for those who want to review them or may have missed them. We do have the opportunity to engage our audience through the Q&A tab. Please put your questions that end with a question mark in the Q&A, and our co-moderators will try to get to as many of them as we can after our initial presentation from our guests. At this point, I'd like to introduce Professor Paul Peterson, who is the Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government here at Harvard and is the director of our program. Paul?
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Antonio. The final session of our conference on a modern teaching profession is, the topic is today, teacher preparation. And it's fitting that that's the topic because today is D-Day, the 80th anniversary of the successful invasion of Normandy, the decisive moment that signaled the end of Hitler's control of Europe. Preparation was key to victory. General Dwight D. Eisenhower led an extraordinarily well-prepared group of armed forces, and Hitler was caught unprepared. So it's fitting that we talk about teacher preparation because preparation is as important to success in the classroom as it is to success on the battlefield. So to discuss teacher preparation, we have three extraordinarily well-qualified panelists. Our co-moderator, Michael Hartley, will introduce them. He is a professor at Boston College and a fellow at the Hoover Institution. He is an expert on teacher policy and teacher representation. Michael, would you introduce our panelists?
Yes, absolutely. First, we have Dr. Heather Peske. She's president of the National Council on Teacher Quality, where she's led that organization since 2022. Prior to that, Dr. Peske was a senior associate commissioner for instructional support in the Massachusetts Department of Education. After Dr. Peske speaks, we'll hear from Dan Weisberg. Dan is the first Deputy Chancellor of the New York City Public Schools. Deputy Chancellor Weisberg's portfolio of responsibilities includes post-secondary readiness, human resources, policy, and enrollment. And finally, we have with us Dr. Peter Blair, who is an economist that studies education, labor markets, and occupational licensing. Dr. Blair is currently associate professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a research associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research. Heather, we'll turn things over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thanks to Dr. Peterson for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm looking forward to engaging with all of you. So I was asked to set the stage a little bit about teacher preparation in the US, and I'll just quickly say that NCTQ, the National Council on Teacher Quality, we're focused on ensuring that all students have access to an effective, diverse teacher workforce. And as Paul said, that means that we need a prepared teacher workforce. So teacher preparation is infused in everything that we do. And the reason why teacher prep matters is because teachers matter so much to student outcomes, a variety of student outcomes. They're the number one factor, the number one in-school factor when it comes to making a difference for kids, a fact that families well know, but a fact that's also backed up by the research. So how does teacher prep work in the US? Well, the first thing to know is that, and I know many of you out there are experienced in this, so if you are, just bear with me, but I just want to set the context. The first thing to know is that in most states, teacher prep programs produce the majority of certified teachers, though alternative programs, those programs that are often not run through a university, are seeking to gain more market share, especially in some specific states like Texas or New Mexico. And we can talk a little bit more about what it means to have varied providers, as well as what it means to try to control quality within that. So when we analyzed the data from Title II, which is a requirement that the feds produce the data on the production of teachers coming out of teacher prep programs, the most recent data available is from the 2020-2021 school year. And what it shows is that among both traditional and alternative programs, we have about 160,000 teachers who completed the program in 2022, which is the year for the most recent data available. This represents a decline of about 200,000 teachers completing their program a decade earlier in 2012, about which many folks have written. And I would urge us to say that, yes, there is a decline. And if you look at historical patterns, we're actually on the uptick again when it comes to the production of teachers, though it is assuredly lower than it was about a decade ago. And about of that 160,000, about 121,000 come from traditional teacher preparation programs that are nested within colleges or universities. Now, I will say that teacher prep programs are sometimes critiqued for being what people refer to as the cash cow of universities, meaning that teacher prep programs generate a lot of revenue for universities, particularly in places where there are large numbers of candidates who are entering and hopefully completing the teacher prep programs. And the reason that's important is that when you have a cash cow, this can compromise quality, in that there's often little incentive for universities or the states within which they're situated to limit or shut down ineffective teacher prep programs. I would also add that the current narrative around teacher shortages, and to be clear, there are teacher shortages in specific subjects and specific regions and specific schools, but they're not this wholesale teacher shortage that is being claimed. But the narrative around teacher shortages also contributes to hampering or limiting efforts to try to ensure quality. Because if you're saying that you're going to limit the production of teachers from universities because they're not strong enough, then clearly principals and district leaders will say, well, where am I going to get these teachers? Where are they going to come from? So I would just note that states set standards and they hold teacher prep programs accountable through reviews, which they either do themselves or they cede their authority to national accreditors. And usually they have this authority through law or regulation. And the reason that states have such power over teacher prep programs is that they authorize them to be able to issue licenses, certification, which is a really valuable commodity. And oftentimes states are not using strongly enough that leverage that they have over teacher prep programs to ensure that they are producing teachers who are prepared on the first day, not day 3,000 when they're 3 or 4 years into it, but on the first day they enter classrooms to be effective with kids. So to this question, to wit, are teachers being adequately prepared? What are we seeing? So for more than a decade, NCTQ has been setting standards for teacher prep programs across the nation, and we've reviewed hundreds of programs against these standards. And we set these standards in looking at questions like, to what extent are elementary teachers being well prepared to teach math or to teach reading? To what extent do they have the content knowledge they need in science or in social studies and civics to be effective with kids? So the headline here is that far too many teachers are being inadequately prepared. And then they get into districts, and we rely on the districts to remediate their lack of knowledge, which is hugely costly, both in terms of time and in terms of financial resources. Not to mention, we often lose teachers because they get into classrooms, they're well-intentioned, and then they don't do well, they're not successful, and that's when they decide to leave. And it comes as no surprise, I'm sure, to many of you who are listening and watching today to learn that the schools that have the highest turnover rates are the schools where we most need stability and expertise. And that's our schools that have the highest percentage of students living in poverty, the highest percentage of students of color, and the highest percentage of students who are English language learners and students with disabilities. Many of the schools that Dan is leading right now in New York City. So what are we seeing specifically at NCTQ when we look at the teacher prep programs to see how well they're preparing teachers? Let me start with reading. Now, we have 50 years worth of research that shows us what we need to be doing to effectively teach kids to read. We call it offhandedly the science of reading. It's based on thousands of studies of thousands of children. And we are really clear what we need to do in order to teach reading and in order to prepare teachers to be effective in teaching reading. Yet when NCTQ looked at over 700 elementary teacher prep programs across the US, what we found is that only a quarter of them, only 25% of these teacher prep programs we're adequately addressing all 5 of the core components you need to know how to teach when it comes to the science of reading. Things like phonics, phonemic awareness, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. Only a quarter of the programs across the nation that we reviewed are adequately addressing all 5 core components of the science of reading. But even more concerning is that another 25% of them do not adequately address any of those 5 core components. And nearly 1/3 of programs, 30%, don't provide any opportunities for aspiring teachers to practice the skills concretely connected to instructing in the research of the science of reading, despite wide agreement from the field about the importance of practice. I think to the earlier point Paul made, we couldn't imagine that any of those troops that landed on the beaches would have gone in without preparation or not knowing how to use their weapons. I mean, I don't always love battleground analogies to teaching, but just to be clear, we have a number of teachers who are entering classrooms without the preparation they need to teach reading. And what it means right now is that 1.3 million 4th grade students, based on our last NAEP data, struggle to learn to read. And that data is even worse when it comes to students of color. Now, when it comes to math, some of you may be wondering about this. I have a little bit better news. The prep programs have made progress in some areas, but they're still really lagging behind the standards that we have and for what they should be doing to prepare aspiring teachers. So when we looked at, again, hundreds of prep programs across the nation, and I'm looking at my notes here, we found that on average, our undergraduate programs added about 19% more time for overall instruction and preparation in math since 2014. So in about the last decade, they've added 19% more time. That is really good news. It's especially good news because a lot of times when you talk to folks in higher ed, they understandably say that it's really hard to add minutes or even hours of time to courses. They're just very constrained. Thanks. Antonia's reminding me to wrap up shortly, which I will do. So what we found is that they added about 19% more time. So that's good news at the undergraduate level. By comparison, our graduate programs are a disaster. The average graduate program spends less than a single credit hour on math content in preparing folks to get into classrooms. So despite the fact that they've added more hours, they're not focusing enough total time on the content of the math that elementary teachers need. So they spend a lot of time on how to teach math, but much less time ensuring that the elementary teachers have the math content knowledge they need in order to enter classrooms and be successful. And that's problematic because although as a nation, we're often dismissive of math skills to our peril, it's problematic because you need to understand that if you're teaching fractions in 4th grade, that's connected to teaching proportional reasoning in 7th grade. The last thing I would add before I do wrap up is that the clinical practice is really important. And Paul talked about this in the beginning of introducing the webinar. Teachers who are aspiring need a strong clinical practice experience to make an impact on the first day. NCTQ recently published a report where we outlined, based on research and based on feedback across the field, we outlined 6 different aspects of clinical practice. We distilled them into these 6 focus areas. So if you're curious to know more, you can certainly look up that report. But the thing I would say is that the research tells us that when aspiring teachers have effective clinical practice experiences, they are often likely to be 1 or 2 years ahead of those candidates who do not have that effective clinical practice experience. And so we should talk more about what that looks like, how you create it, and how to ensure that it happens. So just to wrap up, teacher prep is incredibly important, and we really need to make sure that in policies and practices, particularly at the state level, we're setting high standards for teacher prep, we're being clear about what they need to teach, and we're reviewing them against those standards and holding them accountable. I will turn back to you, Michael. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Heather. Dan?
Thanks very much, Michael. Thank you, Dr. Peterson, and Michael for the invite. Good afternoon, everybody. I've really been looking forward to this. This is going to be a great discussion. Heather has got us off to a really good start. So I come to you today really as kind of the consumer. We in New York City public schools end up hiring over 4,000 new teachers every year. In some years, it's been as high as 7,000 teachers a year. So, and teachers, of course, are the lifeblood of the system and are the critical resource for our 915,000 students. So this is extraordinarily high stakes for us, this being the quality of the preparation that our new teachers receive. And what I'm going to argue today is that this is a sector striving mightily to serve kids and serve the mission, but is really in need of radical change, not small tweaks. What's my evidence for that? Let me just quickly pose three different pieces of data. So one is that the idea behind, I think we'd all agree, the idea behind teacher preparation programs, which involve a significant investment among the students of tuition money, of time, of effort. The idea is it's going to prepare you to be an effective teacher, to help your students to develop, to learn, to have a great experience in school. And what we find again and again and again, and this is over decades in the research, is that people who are charged with teaching who have not had any formal educator preparation experiences are pretty much just as effective. And most recently, coming out of COVID, we saw studies coming out of Massachusetts and New Jersey showing that emergency certified teachers were getting outcomes along different dimensions using different data about the same as our traditionally certified teachers. One really interesting anecdote coming out of Oakland, a community-based organization there that the Oakland Reach, that was supplying high school grads, basically moms and dads from the community, with 10 weeks of training, were getting really good outcomes around literacy when they were following a structured literacy program. Think about that for a second, folks. So, you have somebody committed, loving kids, committed to education, spending, let's say, 2 years in a graduate program to get a master's degree. In New York State, by the way, you have to get a master's degree in order to become a permanently certified teacher. You're working really hard, doing all the coursework, doing the student teaching, and it turns out your kids are doing no better than somebody who didn't invest any of that time. That to me speaks of a fundamental problem, not a small problem. Second piece of evidence that we need some really radical rethinking of how we do educator prep is the fact that we are fishing from only one end of the talent pool. A majority of our K-12 students are now identify as students of color, but Heather will correct me if I'm wrong, but about 80% of our teachers still identify as white. We have not made much progress. And what that means, that's a problem according to the research, because we know that particularly students of color, but really all students, do better when they have diverse teaching workforces who are responsible for them. But also, just in a much more utilitarian point of view, it means that we are excluding, as a field, we are excluding so many talented potential teachers who never get into the profession. More on that in a second. And then third reason to me that speaks to the need for radical change is the chronic shortages that Heather talked about in her presentation. In the entire state of New York, where you all know we have a very large and very robust and excellent higher education system. We've got great institutes of higher education, not just in New York City, but upstate, all over Long Island, all over the state. All of our schools of education collectively don't produce enough math certified teachers to meet our need just in New York City. And we're about 40% of the students in the state. And that's not a new problem. That's not a COVID problem. That has been true since I was going to public school here in New York City eons ago. So we can't seem to crack the code under the current structures to make sure that we are preparing the number of special education teachers, the number of bilingual teachers, the number of even art teachers and music teachers, the number of secondary STEM teachers that our kids need. And that has really deleterious effects on our student learning. So we got to do things differently. I'll just, I don't want to take a ton of time so we can get to the questions and get to Dr. Blair, but I will say there's three things I would suggest we ought to look at as we're talking about what changes do we need to teacher prep. One is we got to remove unproductive barriers to entry. And I want to be clear about that. Unproductive barriers to entry, not all barriers to entry. I'm going to be very clear about this. Teaching is one of the most intellectually demanding and otherwise physically demanding professions that exist. We don't want people just walking in off the street and pick anybody to teach our kids. Not at all. We got to make sure that they are getting preparation. But unproductive barriers to entry are a problem. And what am I talking about? The coursework constructs that we have, the expense that goes with that, many of the certification exams as currently constructed. These are collectively excluding a lot of potential teaching candidates, disproportionately potential candidates of color, disproportionately people who come from modest economic backgrounds. That's a problem because when you look at the other side of it, the screens that we are using now are certainly not helping us to ensure everybody who steps in that classroom is well prepared. It is not a guarantee by any stretch that you have an effective teacher in front of the classroom. But let's impose meaningful barriers to entry. And I think my colleagues would agree, the research is pretty robust. The thing that best predicts whether your kids are going to learn as a teacher, whether you are effective as a teacher, by far and away, is whether your past performance shows that your kids have learned. We can construct apprenticeships, residencies, where we're able to not only give people the skills they need to be good teachers, but to determine whether they are effective in helping our kids learn and grow and feel welcomed and feel like they belong. Second, Heather alluded to this. I think this is critically important. In New York City, we essentially end up having to do the job of teacher prep to make sure our teachers know the substance of what they're going to teach. And, like that's an incredible thing that Heather cited. A lot of our teachers coming out of teacher prep with less than a full credit of math content. For elementary teachers. Same is true with, we are spending a ton of time and money making sure our teachers understand not just the principles of the science of reading, but how to teach from a curriculum that is based in the science of reading. That should be something that's done before they become a certified teacher. It isn't happening now. We need to really change the nature of what it is we're trying to inculcate in our teacher candidates. And then finally, teachers, the job of teaching, again, incredibly intellectually challenging. You are trying to figure out how to help 20 or 25 or 30 young people to learn and grow and have a great experience. Mostly what you are doing is hopefully not designing something brand new every day. Most of what you're doing is customizing a curriculum, an intervention program, some other type of program to make sure your kids benefit from it. And yet our teachers come out of ed school, for the most part, having no real grounding, practical grounding in what it means to implement a program. And so they're doing the best they can. They don't, they haven't experienced what it looks like to take a really good research-based curriculum that has produced amazing results, particularly for chronically underserved kids, and implement it with fidelity. They haven't had that experience. That's a really important skill for teachers, and right now they don't get it. I will stop there, make sure we have time for Dr. Blair and Q&A. Back to you, Michael.
Great. Thank you so much. Peter.
Yeah. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome, in a sense, virtually to Harvard. It's great to welcome you here. And I'm really grateful to be on this panel with Daniel and with Heather about this incredibly important topic. A lot of my work is on occupational licensure, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the work of one of my former PhD students, Bobby Chung, who's now a professor at the University of South Florida, who's looked at the impact of these teacher licensure requirements on student performance. But before I do that, let me just share a little bit of a personal anecdote. I come to this work as a third generation teacher. My grandmother was an elementary school teacher. Both my mom and dad were teachers at the middle school level. My mom taught elementary school, middle school, high school, and she also taught at a community college, which later became a college. And I myself am a professor, and I've taught kids in a K through 12 setting as a part of a science summer camp that I co-founded. And I teach teachers at Harvard in the Graduate School of Education, and I've learned so much from them about what it means for me myself to be a more effective teacher. So let me first start with that, like turn the lens inward on me a little bit, because I think oftentimes teachers can be under siege when we have these conversations, because they can feel as if either they're not doing enough or they're not supported enough. And so when I think about my own experience coming to Harvard and teaching at a graduate school of education, although I had been a professor for 3 years before that, the level of excellence that the teachers who I served at Harvard required of me picked my teaching up to another level, because they were concerned about how is the economics that they were learning in my courses going to be relevant for the students and the families that they serve. And it's challenged me to ask different questions of my own research, and also to think more deeply about my own pedagogy too. Let me touch on something that Dan mentioned with respect to removing unnecessary barriers. So a lot of my own research work looks at occupational licensure. And one of the papers that Bobby wrote with one of his co-authors looked at the rollout of the ADTPA assessments, which is something that allows you to evaluate a teacher's like curriculum preparation and then also their actual teaching performance. And the goal of that program, which is in several states now, was to help teachers to be a lot more prepared so that when they go in the classroom, they could deliver better results for the kids. So what's the headline? If you compare places that implemented this program or added this to the existing licensure requirements to states that did not, what you see is that there are fewer teacher candidates coming up in education programs in universities, and that's disproportionately teachers of color and teachers from less selective schools, right? And that's a generic feature of licensure. Whenever you erect a barrier to entry, fewer people come through the spigot. Now, the question is, do you get higher quality teachers? Well, if you look at outcomes, primarily just looking at student test scores, you don't see any impact on student test scores. And so, what does this study suggest? It suggests that when you increase these barriers to entry, you get fewer folks, you're selecting away from people already underrepresented within the profession, and you're not getting the performance bump up. And so we really have to think a lot about what are the policy targets that we have in mind when we are training teachers? What are we trying to optimize towards? And in terms of evaluating these strictures, we have to think about to what extent are they helping us to achieve these targets. And I think when it comes to licensure, there's a lot of reason to believe that the existing state of licensure, there are ways that we can improve it. We certainly don't want teaching to be a profession where we think anybody can just walk up and be a teacher. And then at the same time too, we don't want to create a situation in which people who have the skills and passion to be a teacher are dissuaded from doing that. The point that Heather and Dan mentioned about schools having to train a lot of folks in the substantive areas, I think that's a really big problem. And one of the things that I experienced in my own educational journey. So when I was finishing up my undergrad, I went to Duke in North Carolina. I was a physics and math major, and I thought about teaching. But when I looked at what I would have to do to be qualified to teach, I thought, well, I'm not going to do that because this is just too much work to do that. And I was an A student in physics and math, but there wasn't a path for me to come into this profession. So I think that we ought to be thinking a lot more about how can we pre-qualify some people who have the subject matter expertise, certainly in these hard to staff teaching positions, and then not only pre-qualify them through some kind of an exam, but actively recruit them. Imagine, Heather, if one of the things we did was we looked at the GRE subject tests for math and for physics and other disciplines. And we actually recruited some of these folks who were going to go to graduate school in physics or math and said, hey, why don't you come and teach for a couple of years before you go to graduate school? That's our pipeline. We ought to be thinking about ways that we can expand the pipeline of people who are both qualified and interested in teaching. When we look at many of the industries where a lot of our graduates at Harvard both go to, for example, banking, finance, the startup industry, we have recruiters that come to campus that are actively saying, hey, we want you to work at our company. And they don't just come in the last year of college, but they're creating internships in the, after the freshman year, the sophomore year, and the junior year. What are ways that we as educators can think about creating internships that somebody can do to explore teaching as a potential pathway and build up the relevant experience and begin to get some of that, the credentialing, right? So I think that there's some innovative ways, some truly low-hanging fruit that we can approach. And I want to add on to this too, when we think about whatever these targets are that we have in mind for student success, I want to encourage us to think about how can we broaden the aperture to bring families into the question too? Because oftentimes we think about the production function of education as just students and teachers. And if only we had better teachers or more qualified teachers, we would have better student success. But the reality is teachers are co-creating alongside parents and communities the educational experiences that our students are going to be getting. And so if a child is learning something in the classroom and they get to translate that at home, that can reinforce the learning that they're going to be experiencing. So for example, I speak French, je parle français. And one of the reasons why I speak French is because I have 6 older brothers and they all took French. And when I got to the point, Heather, where I could spell, if they wanted to say something that they didn't want me to understand, instead of spelling it, they started to say it in French. And so Daniel, I said, well, I need to learn French so that my brothers can't say stuff about me that I don't know, right? And so this is an example of the home environment reinforcing something that is happening in the classroom. And I believe that we ought to think a lot more expansively about building up these family school partnerships in a really meaningful way. And my colleague, Dr. Karen Mapp, she has built out the dual capacity framework, where she has gone around the nation and the world really talking about the importance of schools engaging families in the educational process and families connecting with schools as well too. Because oftentimes, I think, especially for some of our most vulnerable learners, their parents may not understand the various constructs within the school, or how homework is assigned, or when PT meetings are happening, or many things that other better resource parents understand. And by reducing some of that informational gap, number one, by increasing the level of trust between schools and families, we can get an amplification mechanism of the things that students are learning in the classroom. Because one of the things I worry about is it that we have teachers that are not effective, or is it that the efficacy of our teachers would be boosted if the things that they were teaching in the classroom were supported in the home, and vice versa, right? Like if a kid is showing up to school and they've eaten their meals, if the parent has checked their homeworks, if the parent has a live connection to the teacher and vice versa, then does the child know that the messages that are being delivered at school are going to be reinforced at home? Does that further amplify the incentive that they have to learn? And I wonder, I really wonder, Michael, are there synergies that we could potentially unlock by tapping into and strengthening the relationships between families and parents? And just to summarize, I think, one, we have to remember that teachers are an important part of the production process, but then so are the families. Two, we have to really think about what are the things that we're trying to optimize for when we erect these barriers to entry for the education professional. We think about certification, and we have to evaluate these examinations and these certification processes and licensure processes against what the relevant targets are, and we need to update. 3, we need to think about ways to broaden the aperture and pre-select people into the teaching profession who have the skills, expertise, and the passion. And we need to do that intentionally by thinking about how do we design internships along the educational pathway or journey. And I think that especially coming out of COVID, and especially with the advent of generative AI, where we're going to have to think a lot about how do we reconceptualize what does it mean to learn? What does it mean to prepare lesson plans when you have generative AI that can help you with it? I think that there's really a unique opportunity for us to leapfrog and make some substantial progress on leveraging teacher training in concert with family engagement for the betterment of our students.
Well, thank you all, panelists, for excellent presentations. Let me initiate the discussion by asking Dan, who's had this experience administrating a very large educational system, and who makes the provocative suggestion that we need to do radical reform in teacher preparation. Just exactly what would you do and how could it possibly be done?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I'm and interested to hear what my colleagues have to say. The short-term change that I would suggest is at the policy level and largely at the state level, although I think there is a role for the federal government to play as well. And that is not to summarily eliminate the current structures and systems and regulations, but to open up very different pathways. And one of the things I want to address here, Heather, you touched on this, there are, of course, alternative certification programs. They really differ state by state. What that means in New York State, basically, is you just have to delay, you're able to delay taking all the coursework and all the certification exams. I think states ought to be open, and there are some states which have really eliminated a lot of barriers, but haven't really put in my view, put any thoughtful alternatives in place of the type Peter is alluding to in his remarks. What I would do, Paul, is in New York State right now, allow districts that are interested, and we would certainly be one of them, to do true residencies in the context of paraprofessional experience. We have 25,000 paraprofessionals in New York City. These are people who love kids, who are teaching kids every single day, who are much more likely to live in the communities that the kids come from, who very often, by the way, have degrees and have at least some college coursework. And there is essentially no real pathway for them to become teachers. And by the way, to earn a middle-class salary, very importantly, and begin to develop, for those coming from lower income backgrounds, generational wealth. So I would right away, Paul, create a real pathway. What does that look like? That means in a context of earning your salary as a paraprofessional, you are getting opportunities, structured opportunities to actually teach curriculum to kids. You're getting some coursework requirements, but minimal. You are getting really good mentorship, and we are getting to take a look at how well your kids learn, and that becomes your ticket to certification. In other words, if we have a paraprofessional who has a bachelor's degree, who spends a year or two doing small group instruction and assistant teaching while they are earning a living, they should, as they are doing that, earn their certification, and where they don't have a college degree, earn their college degree as well, all at zero cost, all at zero cost. And if we can do that, set up that alternative, not the exclusive pathway, but an alternative pathway through this type of residency, and then let's study it. Let's look and see, are those teachers producing real value to the profession and real value to kids and families? If the answer is yes, then let's start to broaden those true alternative pathways, zero cost pathways for folks who create a track record of being effective with kids. Then I think we'll be on the road to radical change.
That's a radical suggestion. You lived up to your promise there, Dan. Panelists, do you have any reaction to it?
I can jump into that. I want to second what Dan has said. I think that a lot of our workers learn through their work experience. And for me, even as someone who came into the teaching profession with a PhD, I learned once I was on the job. And so Dan is absolutely right that we have a lot of paraprofessionals with relevant experiences. And we need to think about ways to credential them. So one of the research programs that I've done, Paul, is looking at workers who don't have college degrees and recognizing that they're skilled through alternative routes, so they're STARS. And this has created a national movement for folks to tear the paper ceiling, which is using degrees as a way of screening out people who are otherwise qualified based on their work experience. And so I completely plus one that, because instantly we open up the aperture to people who are interested, who are qualified otherwise. And as a society, we begin to learn about how do we create viable alternative pathways that's opening up the profession to more qualified people. So a huge plus one to Dan's point.
I have agreement and some disagreement, so I'll just jump in, as you might imagine. So first, I think it makes a lot of sense that we create multiple pathways into a graduated set of roles before one would become a teacher. So I'm actually kind of worried, Peter, about the advice that you just gave, that people need to learn on the job. I mean, I don't really mind if you're learning on the job to be an associate professor with a bunch of graduate students. I really mind if you're teaching my child and you don't have much knowledge, and if my kid doesn't get access to the math she needs in 4th grade, we know that she's going to start falling behind, and then she's not going to be able to access college-going courses, and she may not get a college degree. So the stakes are incredibly high. And unless we change the structures of teaching such that we have a team of people who are responsible for a set of kids, which is a revolutionary idea that we should start employing, we need to make sure that that one teacher who's assigned to those 25 elementary kids knows what they're doing. So this notion of course, everyone learns on the job, but there's a certain threshold that you need to know before you enter classrooms, or you're going to damage kids. And I would say I really liked the language that Dan used around meaningful, productive gateways in order to ensure that people have the content knowledge they need. We have a set of standards for what people need to know. And those should be measured before they get in. So for example, just throwing away licensure exams, I don't think is a good policy. However, NCTQ reviewed the 25 reading licensure exams that are on the market right now. And guess how many of them actually align with the research and the evidence on how you should teach reading? It's more than one, Antonio. It's 11 that we found out of 25 that were acceptable, but only a handful of those, I think it's about 4, did we consider to be strongly aligned to the research. So we call this report false assurances because it's essentially, it's a waste of time for the candidates who are taking these tests, and it's also a waste of their money. And many of them have to take it multiple times because they fail. So it's a waste of their money, and then it discourages them from entering the profession. And there are disparate pass rates between test takers of color and candidates of color. And so we really need to ensure that if we're going to use licensure tests, that they're, what did Dan say, meaningful, productive gateways. And some of them are. There's a very strong test in Massachusetts, and we did an analysis. It's our Foundations of Reading. We did an analysis when I was at the state agency there to see to what extent performance on that exam actually was a predictor of your value added when it came to kids. And there was a statistical relationship between those two things. Similarly, when we talk about emergency licenses and emergency certification, there's evidence that shows that just having an emergency license, walking into a classroom and having an emergency license is not good for students. And so, Dan, you referenced at the beginning, emergency licensed teachers in Massachusetts. The first study that came out showed that there wasn't a difference between the teachers who were emergency licensed and those who entered the classroom having had traditional preparation. That was because, and I was the one who managed the emergency license program, that was because the first group of teachers to go in already were setting out to be teachers. They just hadn't completed their preparation. But the ensuing cohorts of folks who were licensed on emergency licenses, who went in, by the way, to our highest poverty schools and districts, those results were not as impactful as teachers who'd had preparation. So I think the radical question we need to pose is, what specific skills and knowledge do these teachers need before they get into classrooms to be effective with kids? And what are the measures that we use, as well as the preparation we provide? And that's where we need to blow things up. To Dan's point, we don't need people doing a bunch of courses that are meaningless. It's a waste of their time. It's a waste of money. And we're not tapping into pools of people who are already committed to schools. I'll stop now.
Well, my question is for Heather, but of course others are free to jump in. It's about policy levers to reform teacher prep in traditional colleges of education. And so I'm not sure if you would agree with this, but I think one of the challenges when you have tenured faculty that have been trained to teach, say, reading in a certain way to the students that are going to those schools, it's not as if even a reform-minded dean or a provost can just come in and summarily dismiss all of those faculty members. So are there any policy levers that you can provide, if we have a state folks on the call, that they can do without simply like they can't just restock who the faculty are overnight, even though we have more and more knowledge now about the best way to teach reading or the best way to teach math. What can be done? Is it an incentive-based thing, or what would you advise on that front?
I think it's a variety of levers. I mean, I talked about the first one. Having been a state policymaker, I know like we set standards and we reviewed our teacher prep programs. And when they didn't meet those standards, we put in place conditions for them to improve. Now, I will tell you, it is very politically difficult to close down a teacher prep program. Dan knows this. Paul knows this. Those of you who are out there who've tried to do it or who've managed it know this. However, and I know it from experience. There was one program in particular that was really, really poor. And it happened to be a high producer in Massachusetts. We tried to shut their program down, and the result was not good. Now, I will say we did signal to them and we did set in place conditions for them to improve, and they did improve. So there are ways in which state agencies need to better leverage their authorities. An example of that is Colorado. Their state legislature, their governor's office, their state board, and their state education agency together decided that their teacher prep programs were not meeting standards, particularly in teaching reading. They set those standards, they reviewed them frequently, and they threatened to shut some of them down. They put some of them on conditional approval. Now, is this the only policy solution? No. But at the end of the day, like it's the state that allows these programs to license candidates. And so they really need to leverage that authority more strongly than many of them do. That's one type of example of policy that could be put in place. I also wanted to pick up on Dan's point about zero cost. It is really important that we invest more in candidates who are setting out to be teachers. We do that with medical schools, where we offer federal subsidies to allow people to study to become doctors, particularly when they're going into high shortage areas or high shortage areas of medicine. And we need to make those similar kinds of investments on the side of education. So those are some examples of the types of policies we could employ.
I'll throw on one more point, Michael, to this question. Yeah, I'm no expert on higher education, but know that yes, it's they are often small d democratic institutions where the power is kind of diffuse. So it's not so easy for a university president to make a quick change. But another plug for true alternative pathways. Right now, I'll just use New York State. Higher education really has a monopoly. You cannot become a certified teacher. And this is not true in every state, but I think, Heather, it's true of most, certainly true in New York. You cannot become a teacher without first getting a degree from an institution of higher ed. How you get there, when you get that degree varies a little bit, but you must go to an institution of higher education to get that degree. If you create a true alternative, a much more experiential program, again, with very rigorous entry standards, but not largely based on coursework. So the monopoly is not there. And if some of those true alternative programs, like for paraprofessionals, are able to produce results that are as good or better, this is not about certainly eliminating the role of higher education at all, but I think that will create its own external pressure. And some of the things that Heather and NCTQ have done such a great job of analyzing, the shortcomings in the higher ed programs, they will start to react with all the constraints that exist, around faculty and so forth, because they're now no longer the only game in town.
So, Peter, does this mean that we can abolish licensing in education? Does this mean that we can sort of say, once you create an alternative, then you have an opportunity to sort of say, okay, lots of people can take this alternative, and really the licensing system is going to be under a lot of pressure. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think we always have to ask, what is our goal in terms of what we're trying to do? It can be very easy to have an ideological position with respect to licensure, to say, oh, licensure is bad or licensure is good. And I think oftentimes these debates can proceed in that kind of a way. I try not to do that. A lot of my own research, Paul, has been to say licensure is a really important institution. About 20% of US workers, not just teachers, but are required to have licenses, and that's the same in the EU as well. the question then becomes, what do these licenses do? So for example, I have work showing that licensed workers of color face smaller racial wage gaps. And so that was something that wasn't really known. But then at the same time, too, when you license an occupation, fewer people can come through that door, right? And so it's not so much about licensure or non-licensure. I think we have to center what is the problem. And the problem is, or at least the problem is, we're trying to provide high quality education at scale for folks through using teachers, public schools, private schools, a whole host of delivery mechanisms. And then the question is, how do we do that, right? And I think, coming back to the conversation, a little bit of a debate between Heather and Daniel around alternative pathways is I do think that we should have alternative pathways. I'm very sensitive to Heather's point that we shouldn't lower the standards for those alternative pathways at all. I think it's about having different ways of qualifying people. At the end of the day, what we care about is how effective are they at driving learning. And if that person is effective because they've seen someone do it like multiple times and they've figured out through osmosis in a sense what works, versus someone who is more of a pencil and paper bookish learner before they can translate, we should have viable ways for doing both of those. I want to also mention too, I think that one of the things that I worry about is that when it comes to education, we talk a lot about imposing standards and we don't talk as much about compensation. Because if you impose all of these standards, but it's not a well compensated profession, then do you think people are just going to jump through all of these hoops to meet all of these standards and not get paid commensurately? There are lots of other jobs where you don't have to impose standards, but because you pay people really well, like folks are pouring into that profession. And even if we look at the teaching profession in other parts of the world, so take Singapore, for example, in order to be a teacher in Singapore, you have to come from the top third of your university class. And teachers, they're paid really well. And the teaching profession is respected a lot. And so there's this deeper ontological question that we have to ask, which is, how do we improve the prestige of the teaching profession to the point where someone is choosing between going to work for Goldman Sachs versus going to work for a school in the Bronx, right? And that isn't just about licensure. That isn't just about schools of education. I think that's also about the profession itself. And we have to ask, how are the organizations within the teaching profession creating opportunities for professional development, opportunities for elevating the role of the profession, opportunities for expanding who is considering becoming a teacher. And I think that is, an area for that's potentially an area for innovation. I might be wrong on that, but I think it's an area of innovation.
I wanted to ask Dan more specifically about the policy that he referenced in New York with the requirement to pick up that master's degree. Can you just maybe share some thoughts on that? I mean, I actually remember this when I had several friends come out of undergraduate and do Teach for America. And I was like, oh, why are you working on this master's degree at Pace? Like, you seem like you're teaching, you're effective. Is this something that's common across the country? Is New York particularly rigorous there? Where do you come down on the costs and benefits of that policy? Because I do think that from what we know on the research of a master's degree in education, the effects of how strong of a teacher you are, it's really contingent on whether it's a master's degree in your subject area versus just kind of a general master's degree in education.
Yeah, I'm sure Heather will weigh in and has much better knowledge nationally. But as far as New York goes, I mean, at a public university, that the tuition cost of getting that master's will be upwards of $20,000, and so that's beyond the means of many people who want to become teachers. So it's a huge barrier right there, just based on cost. And you're not typically able to work full time while you're in these programs. So very, very difficult economic. And there just isn't research I'm familiar with that shows that getting that degree, getting the additional credits beyond what many states require, where they don't require the full master's program, that increment somehow makes you more effective. And if Michael, if you look at the course catalogs in a typical graduate education program in New York from outstanding institutions, these are not. A lot of it is theory. A lot of it is not applied work. A lot of it is not content. And so it's not a surprise that taking those courses, while it may be interesting and may help you be prepared in some way, that it's not critical to your effectiveness as a teacher. So I think New York is at one pole on this, has particularly rigorous coursework requirements, but most states, I would say, it is expensive and time consuming to become a teacher, and having to jump through hoops, to Peter's point, that don't really add value to your abilities as a teacher. And we need to figure out what it is that actually is going to be a good predictor of your effectiveness of a teacher, and use those standards, very rigorous, high standards, as opposed to the regime we've got now.
So I have a question. I'm not quite sure who's the right person to answer. I think you all may have an insight. But we know that the teacher after 1 year is a much better teacher. The first year on the job, people learn a lot. Now, is this in the nature of the beast, or is there any way that we can take that fact and make use of it so that as you prepare to become a teacher, you acquire the skills that are going to be necessary in order to be effective the first day on the job? So now Heather says we need to know content, we need to know our math, our reading, and so forth. But the other side of the coin is you just need to know those management skills as you walk into the classroom. So how do we achieve that particular dimension? Who am I going to ask? I'm going to ask Peter.
I think, Paul, we could have more internships. That's what law firms do. That's what Wall Street does, internships for teachers, because I totally get Heather's point, which is you don't want somebody coming and experimenting on your kids. Just the thought of that could be very jarring to a lot of folks. I would say more internships like during the summer and during the school year for people to get the handle of it. And then also more assessments around where are the areas for improvement for a given person. Are you someone who needs to be better in your content area, or are you someone who needs better management skills, as Dan was pointing out? And I'll kick it over to Heather.
All right, Heather, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I would just say those internships are currently called clinical practice, and we've identified these 6 areas, these 6 focus areas for effective clinical practice. And the difference between having an effective clinical practice experience versus one that's really weak is actually years of impact. So if you go in with a weak experience, if you go into teaching, you are less impactful by years of experience than a teacher who had an impactful clinical experience. And that includes things like strong partnerships between districts and prep programs, really strong cooperating teacher matches so that the cooperating teacher you're working with when you're learning is someone who has knowledge and skill. Dan talked about implementation of high quality instructional materials. You should be doing that in your clinical experience, so you're not just learning it on day one. Those cooperating teachers and program supervisors need to have effective training. Kelly Butler alluded to this in some of the questions and the comments, really ensuring that your faculty have the content knowledge they need to have. You need to consider your student teaching placement sites. So you're not placing all of these aspiring teachers in sites that are very unrealistic compared to where they actually will end up teaching. And then finally, you need to analyze the data and the outcomes of the clinical practice experience. We really need to look at the results to see to what extent teachers learn what they need to know. So this idea of putting in place like assessments or gateways along the way, in addition to multiple pathways, to me, that's part of the revolution of teacher prep that Dan described earlier.
So Dan, we'll give you 1 minute to wrap up here.
Oh, gosh. I mean, so I don't know that, I imagine, Peter, you may know this. If you looked at, for example, skilled trades and electricians, probably an apprentice electrician is never going to be as effective overall as a journeyman or journey person electrician. There is something to experience, but the gap between the effectiveness of first year teachers and veteran teachers doesn't have to be as big as it is. And so I agree with Peter wholeheartedly. More internship opportunities. I'll make a quick plug in my 30 seconds. We are creating an education career pathway at our 130 future ready high schools that we have. So we're trying to grow our own and do that. But there is also the apprenticeship model. which is more than internships. And again, we have so many paraprofessionals who are already working full-time with kids. I think that presents great opportunities for real apprenticeships. And what you'll see is that big cliff start to narrow.
Well, thank you all for a terrific panel. It's exciting to end up this conference with such a outstanding discussion of really a critical issue that is going to be one that we do not solve the larger question of an effective school system without addressing this particular topic. So thank you all for joining us on the webinar today. And thank you, our audience, for joining us throughout our several conferences. If you missed a session, they're all recorded. You will be able to come back to the website and see this session as well as all the other sessions of our conference. So thank you very much for joining us on our conference on a modern teaching profession. And we are in this coming fall going to host another conference called Emerging School Models. So please consider that for your fall activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.